Hello, and welcome to our third interview in the Informed Supply Chain webinar series, where we have been exploring a variety of issues around the stress, strain, and opportunities to strengthen America's supply chains. My name is Jeff Cohen. I'm the Chief Strategy and Innovation Officer at Informs, the largest association for the decision and data sciences. Informs members support organizations and governments at all levels as they work to transform data into information and information into insights that lead to better decision-making and more impactful results. Informs' 11,000 members are comprised of diverse and robust experts in data science, analytics, operations research, and other related fields. Their work touches literally every sector and has been responsible for saving lives, saving money, and solving problems across a broad spectrum of areas, including healthcare, transportation, artificial intelligence, and so much more. Today, we are joined by two Informs members and leading experts as we explore how ongoing supply chain disruptions, including the war in Ukraine, are impacting our food supply in the United States and around the globe. First, we're joined by Dr. Anna Nagurney, who is the Eugene M. Eisenberg Chair of Integrative Studies and Director of the Virtual Center of Super Networks in the Department of Operations and Information Management at the Eisenberg School of Management at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. We're also joined by Dr. Tim Lowe, a professor emeritus in the Department of Business Analytics at the Tippie College of Business at the University of Iowa. So Dr. Nagurney, Dr. Lowe, thank you both for joining us today. So let me start with a question that has dominated not just the media coverage, but the hearts and minds of people everywhere. And that is the evolving and tragic situation in Ukraine. Right? It's brought many complexities to the food supply issues in the region, with significant impacts locally, as well as other parts of the world. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the food supply issues that have emerged because of the war in Ukraine. And Anna, given your very personal ties to Ukraine, why don't we start with you?
Thank you so much, Jeff. I don't know how many people know, but Ukraine's food helps to feed about 300 million people around the world each year. It is known as the breadbasket, not only of Europe, but of the world. It is a huge exporter of wheat, of corn, barley, and also sunflower oil. Many, many countries depend on such agricultural products. For example, especially the MENA countries in the Middle East and also in North Africa. And with the war on Ukraine, exports have essentially stopped. Agricultural areas are being mined. As you know, the Black Sea also has mines that are floating on it. Many of the ports are closed. So right now, many farmers are looking forward to the harvest, and it's especially, time to harvest the winter wheat, which was planted in the fall. But it's going to be extremely, extremely challenging. They have to call emergency services to remove mines. They're dealing with all sorts of shortages, also in terms of labor, because many of the workers have gone to fight for the freedom of their country against the Russians. They're also dealing with fuel shortages. So we're seeing problems along, all the links of the supply chain and the pathways, from harvesting all the way of transportation to points of demand. It is a critical time. I think this is, these are acts against not just Ukrainians, but against humankind, because so many people around the globe depend upon the food that is grown in Ukraine. In fact, the World Food Program gets 50% of its wheat. Okay, so the director is worried about catastrophic famine this year because of that. Syria depends on wheat from the World Food Program, Yemen, Lebanon, and also many countries in Africa, for example.
Great, thank you. Tim, anything you'd like to add to that?
No, I think that Anna covered that very well, and we'll talk more about importing food in just a second. So I'm fine with where we are with that.
Great, thank you. So when many people think about food supply in the United States, they know most about the food that's produced locally. But how globalized are our food supply chains, and how reliant are we on supply chains beyond our own border? And Tim, why don't we start with you?
Okay, that's an excellent question because I have quite a few things to say about that. And I really was not aware of this until I actually did a little more research on this issue. The USDA reports that about 20% of the food consumed in the United States, and that's either measured by volume or dollar value, is imported. So it's a huge number. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I'll call consumable foods, and then I'm going to talk about inputs to food production, because I think those are equally important. I mean, you have to have the inputs to grow things, crops, and so forth. Okay, so in the consumable foods realm, I guess one place to start, even though it's obviously not the most important, but it's significant, snack foods. A lot of snack foods are produced elsewhere, potato chips, cookies, things like that. And generally, these are coming from Canada and Mexico. Fruits and vegetables, that's a big chunk of our imports. And actually, the USDA most recently has mentioned that, that number is growing, the amount of vegetables and fruits that we do import. And on a percentage basis, it's actually growing quite quickly, I discovered. In the last 4 decades, the imported vegetables have risen from 6% to about 31%, which is huge. But even more so with fruits. That has risen from 23% to 50%, which means that's more than doubled. So that's a big chunk of our food supply. Major countries where we get them, Mexico and Canada, again, just like I mentioned, with sort of this global number, but also Chile, Peru, South Africa, and Argentina. Seafood is a big chunk of the seafood that's consumed in the U.S. Comes from elsewhere, about 70%, in fact. Now, if you look out on the web at these numbers, sometimes you'll see a number like 90%. That's not right. And it's been pointed out by several people that where the 90% number comes from is sometimes it will have seafood that's harvested here, sent to China, for example, processed there, canned there, and sent back. So, sort of this double whammy across the ocean adds to that percentage number. Obviously, one of the big issues about imported foods, especially fresh foods, are access to refrigerated containers and trailers. There seems to be a real shortage of the availability of the refrigerated containers, period, and then refrigerated containers. They're having trouble finding those. And obviously, we need those because of the special care that's needed for fish or meat or anything else to maintain it in a cool form until it gets unloaded. Now, on the inputs to food production, let me just talk a little bit about that, because I think that's an important element. Fertilizer. We get about 50% of our fertilizer as imported. Places like Trinidad, Tobago, Canada, and Russia, we were getting, at least were, emphasize that, fertilizer from Russia. Materials to produce ag chemicals like pesticides and herbicides, a lot of that stuff comes from overseas. Food additives, things like food additives, and specialty additives. Anna mentioned sunflower oil. That's a big import for us because it's used in things like mayonnaise and margarine and even bread. So that's going to be a problem, I think, at least and hopefully just in the short term, of our being able to get sunflower oil. Okay, then one thing I wanted to mention here, and to sort of shut off my input on imports, special care is really needed in the instance of, imported food. You got to make sure that, pathogens like bacteria and viruses, that there's control on that. So these are really, these are special requirements, I think, in terms of the supply chain itself, that we have to worry about with on the import side.
Great. Tim, thank you. Anna, anything that you'd like to add to Tim's remarks?
Yeah, I think it's really important that Tim emphasized, the perishability aspects of a lot of fresh produce, because issues associated with quality have really been dramatically exacerbated in the COVID pandemic, because we've had so much congestion in ports. Again, as he mentioned, the containers haven't been in the right place and so on. And it's essential that we have proper food quality and also sufficient amounts of food as we battle food insecurity, which is growing not only in our country, but around the world. Something else that I would like to mention, it's being estimated that in the next 5 years, they expect that the US will be importing 75% of our fruit and about 1/2 of the vegetables. So you see, we have these global cold chains now, and that's going to be really, really important to enhance the efficiency and also to preserve the quality and the freshness of a lot of fresh produce.
Yeah, and you're sort of giving me a great lead in here to my next question. During the height of the pandemic, if you will, we saw a lot of Americans in what seemed like endless lines to pick up food. And it really served to highlight for many of us the vulnerability that we have here in the States of our food supply. So could you sort of expand on both of your comments in terms of what those vulnerabilities are, why they exist, and how is it that the pandemic really exacerbated what those are? And Tim, why don't I start with you?
Sure. In fact, I title this topic, "How did we get here? How did we end up with where we are in terms of our supply chain structures and supply chain current situation?" Well, first of all, the supply chain for food is not the same as supply chain for computer chips. The reason for that, first of all, these can be fairly long, and certainly nature plays a role in the supply chain for food that it doesn't for other types of products. Now, so these supply chains can be very long and can be very complicated and can involve a lot of human labor. I give the example. I thought about an example of cornflakes. People get a box of cornflakes either at a food bank or they get it at the grocery store. And it's a box of cornflakes. That box started from a distributor somewhere. So a distributor delivered the box of cornflakes to either of these two potential outlets. Okay, so the distributor got the box of cornflakes from a packaging and processing facility somewhere. Okay, so again, that's another link in the supply chain. And by the way, it's probably trucks that delivered across these two different links or three different links I've mentioned here. So the processor and the packager was having to get packaging materials from somewhere, along with the material to make the cornflakes. The input to the processing would be grain, corn, kernels of corn. That probably comes from a co-op somewhere. I'm in the Midwest, so you see these co-ops all over the place here in the Midwest. The co-ops take the grain from the farming operations, and then the farming operations have to plant seeds the following spring to plant corn. So you've got nature involved, you've got a lot of manual labor involved, you've got a lot of movement, you've got a lot of trucks moving things, maybe rail. So these turn out to be very long in terms of time and involve a lot of different people. Okay, so the length of it, and the fact that nature's involved and anything can screw it up, creates a clog in the supply chain. Okay, so it also turns out that current supply chains, a lot of them were constructed with a focus on cost minimization and lean principles, lean JIT, for example. Now, JIT's been around, actually started back in the 80s with the Toyota production system, but it's moved into all sorts of different parts of our lives. And a part of JIT or lean is, lean inventories, because holding inventories, if they don't move, that accumulates, holding costs and spoilage and all sorts of things. Also, the whole idea of lean says, let's have more cost-effective transportation choices. So instead of trying to be really reactive, what they would choose for, moving things would be at a lower cost. And sometimes that's not the right choice if you have to immediately respond to some hiccup in the supply chain. Also, lack of flexibility. A lot of supply chains now don't have flexibility. And if you read about how to improve things, that's one of the key things that people are trying to stress is make things more flexible. So really, you got that sort of format of the way supply chains were constructed. And then what happened before and then right after the pandemic began is, we think about the sources of demand for food. Before the pandemic, a lot of food was going to what I call food service distributors, like restaurants, hospitals, schools, and so forth. But then once COVID hit, people didn't go to restaurants. So now they're having to get their food in smaller package sizes, which created an issue for the packaging operations. If you read about it, there's shortage of packages. Suddenly now food has to be in smaller quantities, and that really changes the way food flows through the supply chain. In fact, I've seen some estimates on this. I'm going to quote this. They said that the proportion of service food outlets and then grocery stores used to be like 50-50. Then after the pandemic hit, it turned to 70-30. So, much more grocery store than service industry demand for food. Okay, problems at the ports. Significant problems at the ports, and I think we've all read about those. Clogged facilities for loading and unloading shipping containers. And by the way, in fact, Anna, I ran across an article that you wrote some time ago about shipping containers. And shipping containers started in the 1950s, 1956. Those were great when they first came in because, considerable savings in labor associated with loading and unloading goods. But one of the problems is, of course, if the supply chain is designed to use containers and then you have trouble getting containers, it's a no-brainer. You're going to have a problem shipping things if you don't have the equipment that you need to use the supply chain that you've designed. So, clogging at the ports, the difficulty in getting containers in the first place, and it turns out that the cost, even if you're able to get a container, the cost has gone up. It's more than tripled from what I've read. You could get, used to be you get a container for like $3,000, and now it's up to $15,000 or $20,000 in many cases to get a container. So even if they're available, it's an expensive thing to do. And of course, as the cost for shipping material goes up, then the consumer is going to pay more. Okay, so containers is a problem. The shortage of having these things available to ship things. Driver shortages and transportation issues. The American Trucking Association recently estimated that they're short by 80,000 drivers, which is an all-time high. Not enough drivers. Now they're trying to change some of that because there used to be this law about no interstate travel by a truck if a driver's less than 21 years old. So, I mean, that cuts out potentially the 18 to 21-year-olds to actually drive trucks, which then across state lines, which then allows a better shot at on the supply chain movement. They're working on modifying that. They've got a sample sample program, I think, in Florida that they're seeing how that might work out. So anyway, labor shortages, I think I've mentioned that before, all across the supply chain, basically in all segments, production side, manufacturing, packaging, distribution, and of course, last mile delivery. So structural issues caused by leaning too much on JIT principles and lean inventory, and then getting this shocking the system by suddenly the shifts from people needing food have delivered to them or going to the grocery store to get it. So that's about all I've got to say on that. And Anna, I'm sorry I've taken so much time, but that's one of my passions is
No
supply
problem.
chain
I
design.
agree. I agree. I'd like to highlight a couple of things and maybe emphasize a little more. I think we're dealing now with climate change that's having global ramifications. Farmers have to deal with droughts. They have to deal with floods. They have to deal with fires. Okay, that's extremely, extremely challenging. Also, I agree wholeheartedly with Tim. My passion throughout the COVID pandemic is to include labor into modeling supply chain networks into every single link, because without labor and taking care of workers, nothing gets produced, nothing gets harvested, transported, stored, or distributed. So that is absolutely critical. And we've seen how even the migrant workers, how many of them suffer from COVID, many perished. We saw how many meat processing workers also had immense challenges. So I would say climate change and labor, in my opinion, are probably tops. Okay, we also have not enough competition, I would say, in certain sectors when it comes to the food supply chain. For example, you have meat processing plants, essentially top meat processors. It's essentially an oligopoly. Some of them have actually not been paying farmers, cattle farmers, what they actually deserve. So the kind of work that we do in terms of modeling and fair prices, I think, is extremely, extremely important in our profession. Also, we have an aging transportation infrastructure, and it's not just congestion on the ports, but it's almost congestion everywhere, and we don't have sufficient capacity at our warehouses and so on. So it's these supply chains, especially I would say food, because they're highly perishable, are extremely stressed. Okay, and they're dealing with all sorts of capacity constraints. And in addition, something that people maybe aren't as aware of, food processors and food firms have also been subject to cyber attacks in the past couple of years. In September 2021, one of the biggest meat processors, JBS, a Brazilian firm, was subject to ransomware and paid millions of dollars. So that's something else that we really need to be helping. I think all sorts of farmers, meat processors, food processors, because typically their technology is not exactly the latest, it's not up to date, and it impacts, operations, and it has propagating failures and affects the farmers, the producers, and so on. And when I see so many products in the pandemic had to be discarded, by the farmers. So many animals had to be culled. I mean, because there were inefficiencies or, processors weren't taking care of the workers. That was heartbreaking. That should not be happening in our country.
Yeah, right.
And that was happening in other parts of the globe as well.
Right.
And we
So
have trade wars as well on top of everything. You know, in the pandemic, the World Trade Organization instituted hundreds of new trade restrictions, quotas, tariffs, and so on. So I work with Professor Dana Spacek on it, Pritha Duda, other PhD students, Professor Min Yu, and it's really, really important to take our operations research analytics perspective, because we really view supply chains as networks. We view them holistically. They're not just two node, one link networks. You have to, as Tim was saying, you have to handle the suppliers, the processors, and so on, and their behavior as well. You know, what do they care? What do they want to accomplish? You know, profit maximization, you know, equity, you know, effective distribution, preservation of quality, and what have you. So, I mean, I think now, as challenging and as horrific, you know, the world scenario is, I think the expertise that our profession has never been more in demand. And I am so proud of that. Really, really proud.
I am too. I agree.
Yeah.
So you've both done a really marvelous job of painting the complexity, right, of not just supply chains, but of the food supply chain in particular. And I suspect, like many things, you know, most people probably take it for granted. They go to the market, there's their thing, and we tend not to think about everything that's involved. But given the complexity and almost the enormity of the challenge that you've described, and as the federal government is studying what it can do to strengthen supply chains across a variety of areas, including agriculture, wondering what recommendations would you have for the policy community in terms of where they ought to focus and focus first as it relates to the food supply chain. You've talked about any number of topics, but as they think about where to focus and how to get started, any thoughts? And Anna, why don't I start with you?
Okay, first of all, I think we have to support our farmers throughout. That's extremely important, and help them get their foods to market. And we saw in the pandemic how many farmers were becoming very creative, very innovative. They essentially had to survive. There was a growth in farmers markets. There was more direct links to consumers, which is really important because I think it also preserves quality. I want to make sure that farmers, you know, get the supplies that they need at reasonable prices. And now with the fuel prices rising, that's going to be affecting, you know, also our food prices. And we've seen the food prices now are the highest in 60 years. Okay, the United Nations Food Price Index, you know, kind of marks a bunch of commodities and so on, and it's super, super high. Okay, so we need to, you know, battle inflation, I think, as best as we can, and reduce the prices that even farmers have to deal with and people, because of food insecurity. It's growing again. A lot of the federal government programs which were instituted during the pandemic, which helped tremendously, okay, especially many of the impoverished people, they're being scaled back, they're being stopped. So, you know, I'm really, really concerned. So I think the government needs to invest, and we need to support farmers in all the links in the supply chain. I'm hoping with, you know, the big package, we will be investing wisely in transportation links. Okay, we have models, you know, where should you invest? You shouldn't be throwing, you know, money at, say, roads where no one's going to use them and so on. So it's really important that we use our analytical techniques to have the wisest and the best investment for the efficiency of our supply chain networks, with resiliency also factored in. And that's extremely important. And, you know, investing in the productivity of the workers, okay, the freight service workers, you know, the dock workers, everyone, those that run the distribution centers, make sure they have, you know, proper insurance, proper health care, and so on, because only when they're productive will they be able to do their work well. And then we all benefit, you know. And there's, in my opinion, you know, very few products that are more important than food now, and the health and well-being of our children, you know, and the people around the globe.
Great. Thank you, Anna. Tim, anything that you'd like to add to that?
Well, I just want to emphasize again, that as Anna has mentioned, is, you know, the infrastructure. You know, we have problems with bridges. You know, some of these bridges are 50, 60 years old. And, as trucks get larger to move things, they got these huge trucks now on the interstate system. Eventually, this is going to be a big, big problem. It's already a problem. So, I think that, for the transportation side, it's not just trucking, but, it's rail. You got to worry about rail because sometimes that's the best way to move things. And then the ability to move from highway to rail, these areas where, you can make these changes. You take a container and move it from the truck to rail, and then it moves, and then rail to truck. I just think that, we've ignored stuff for a long time on infrastructure. And hopefully we're going to get that straightened out. And I think as Anna has mentioned, that's the kinds of things that people in our discipline do, the analytics work, the operations research work. So hopefully we can make some progress along those lines.
Great. So I know as we were preparing, I've got a question for you here on food insecurity, but I'm not sure if it's a difference without a distinction given some of your other comments. But as the government has begun prioritizing solutions to food insecurity, separate from the question of supply chains, can you talk about, from your perspectives, other solutions or related solutions that the policy community ought to be looking at to really help, tackle the food insecurity question in and of itself?
You're asking me now?
Yes.
Anna, why don't I start with you?
Yeah. Well, right now, the World Bank is estimating that 690 million people are food insecure around the globe. Okay, which is a huge number. And in the US in 2020, about 15% of households with children were food insecure. And when we talk about food insecurity, that means people can't get food to preserve a healthy, active lifestyle. Okay, and in the richest country in the world, that is horrible. There are many parts of the country where you still have food deserts, and that really bothers me. And I think a lot could be done with retailers, grocery stores, and so on in inner cities and other kinds of communities to make sure that, people have access to quality food, to fresh produce, fish and meats and so on. Obviously, you worry about spoilage and so on. So it's clearly easier for people just to buy snack food, right? Kids like snack food. They like the sugar and the salt, but it's not the nutritious food. So I think it's really, really important to have high quality food, so people can easily access it. Ideally, you'd like to have people being able to walk or bike, to food stores like you have in different parts of Europe. I think that is really, really important. Also, now with children being back in school, luckily they can have lunches at school and so on. In the pandemic, in some communities, not all, there were even school buses driving around with lunches for children because they were so worried that children weren't getting food. And for some children, this is, their major source of nutrition is the lunch that is provided. So I also think we need more competition in the food sector. Okay, I do think these big agribusinesses are not the way to go. Okay, we need more food processors, more regionalization, and so on. Also, we're seeing a lot of innovation in this space. And New York Times, Washington Post has recently had huge articles on vertical farms in inner cities. I think that also is a way to go. And we have to do everything we can to battle climate change and so on, because otherwise it's going to get more and more challenging to grow the produce, right? And to do all the farming and so on. So I think that is something that really should be priority number one for all of us.
Thank you, Anna. So building on that, talk about the roles that operations research and data science and analytics can play in better understanding how to reduce food insecurity. And I'm wondering if you could both sort of talk for a couple of minutes about research that you might be doing in the space. And Tim, why don't we start with you?
Okay. Yeah, I guess I could talk a little bit about my my research interests, which I think are certainly applied to this food sector. I'm interested in supply chain design and operations, which is a very broad topic. But I think about some of the things that I've worked on: facility location and distribution operations, where to put things to more efficiently move material through the supply chain. Inventory policies. I think inventory policies are a big deal right now, because what we've found in many instances in the supply chain is insufficient inventory, again, because of lean principles. Well, I just think that a little more thought has to go into the fact that yeah, occasionally you're going to have a burp in the supply chain, and you need to plan for these occasional things. I've also personally have worked in the production side in the food industry. I worked with a seed corn company to determine how to produce seed that's eventually sold to the farming community. What this particular company was doing is producing the seed in the Midwest in the summer, and then if they had insufficient supply for seed for the next spring, then they would take advantage of the fact that there's a different growing season in South America and produce more seed and additional seed in South America. So that was sort of a backup for them in terms of being able to supply stuff to bring it to market. And of course, there are different costs associated with producing it in South America and then shipping it back to the US. So different costs of production and transportation. So that's an example of something that I have worked on in the ag sector. Anna mentioned the World Food Program, and I'd like to briefly mention what they have done in using analytics and operations research. The World Food Program won what's called the Edelman competition, which is sort of sometimes thought about as being the Super Bowl of operations research. These are the best applied projects every year. There's this competition for the winner. And World Food Program was the winner, not this year, but the previous year. And what they did is they developed a web-based optimization tools for food components to places like South Sudan in Africa. The delivery of that food, the design of what the food packages should look like, and think about costs and thinking about the nutrition value of these food packages. And then the delivery methods. They used Anna was talking about network flows. Well, it was essentially a large network-based optimization problem in terms of being able to efficiently deliver food to an area of the world that really needs it because of food insecurity. And just to quickly mention that particular project, there have been many other projects we could talk about, but I want to briefly mention this one because it was a big hit. They estimated they saved up to $150 million. This is on a per year basis. That's enough to support 2 million food insecure people for 1 year. Huge savings. So you cut down the cost of these delivery methods. That means with the same budget, you can actually serve more people. And that's a great example of the use of analytics and operations research in this food insecurity world. So, Anna?
Yeah, thank you very much, Tim. We've been working on food supply chains for quite a while. I've done a lot of work and also on spatial price equilibrium problems, all sorts of network trade models. But the first, I would say, very general supply chain network problem that we published was a paper in 2013 with Professor Min Yu in the European Journal of Operational Research. And it was recognized by the editors as one of the most impactful papers published in the past 3 years. So there, what we did, we used generalized networks to essentially model the throughput of food along different pathways. And you had competing food firms, because no matter what happens, fresh produce will spoil over time. Nothing lasts forever, especially fresh food. So we were also tracking waste, minimization of cost as well as waste, and figuring out the different profits, assuming that consumers could differentiate among the products, and so, but they were still substitutable products. So it was a very nice supply chain network oligopoly model. And we've gone further to work on farmers markets and working with data from food science, which I think is very, very effective, because I love it when in operations research and analytics, we can use like data from chemistry, biology, physics, and use specific formulae that depending upon the conditions, you will have, a certain preservation of the quality level as the food moves through the supply chain, or not, because that's really, really important, because you want to figure out where to invest so the food is as high quality as possible. And the consumers, they are willing to respond. They're willing to pay typically higher prices, when the product is higher quality. So we continue to do work on that. We're revising a paper as we speak here, adding more kinds of stakeholders, food processors, to see what happens to the prices and the profits of farms, of agricultural firms versus, say, processing firms. And also done a series of papers in the pandemic. As I mentioned before, labor has become an obsession of mine. To see what happens when you have labor capacity associated with different kinds of links. What if you have more labor? What would even happen if you could retrain people? So they're not just, say, for example, farmers, but maybe you have shortage of free service workers, okay? And so on. So there we've done all sorts of network optimization models and also game theory models. And I'm very, very proud of that work, okay? It's work that we can continue to do, and I think is really, really important. And it's showing policymakers that you might have unexpected results, okay? And I'm showing, actually, if you pay people fair wages, let the wages equilibrate, you can have higher profits, folks. So pay people what they deserve, okay? I think that's really, really important, really, really effective. So I want to make sure migrant workers stay healthy, so produce gets picked. That's a challenge all around the world. We need to give the workers visas so food does not go to waste, okay? We have major, US is so lucky. We have, rich soil, just like Ukraine has super rich soil. We have to make sure that we most effectively and efficiently get food to the demand markets, to points of demand. Okay, very, very important for the future of society, for the future of humanity. And we have to make sure that, we continue doing research so that the farmers can be as productive as possible. I think that's really, really important with the additional challenges associated with climate change now.
Thank you both. It's both doing very interesting and important work there. So I'm going to wrap up with one last question for both of you. So stepping a little bit just beyond the food supply question, looking forward through your models, through a crystal ball, tapping your expertise, do you see disruptions in the supply chain continuing, or how do you see them continuing short-term, long-term? Or is there hope on the horizon that some of the vulnerabilities are sort of actively being corrected? And I'll throw it to whoever wants to jump in first.
Anna, how's your crystal ball?
I think with investments, we can do much, much better. I think also the world needs peace. We need to stop the war in Ukraine. Okay, that's going to exacerbate food insecurity. We're going to have probably catastrophic hunger around the world. The geopolitical risks are creating huge challenges with transportation in the Black Sea, the Sea of Azov, in Europe. So I think we need to stop the wars and we need peace. Okay, and then we need to focus on what really matters, and that's investing in people and the well-being of people. on the
Right.
planet.
Right, right.
Tim, any
I
further
would
thoughts?
just, oh, sorry, I'd just like to add that, we really need to rethink our supply chains and the structure of our supply chains. And the popular press will tell you, and I believe this too, people have actually thought about it, is simplify. Things, it's too complicated.
Mm.
Things are just too complicated. Products are complicated. How we make products it's complicated. Worrying about efficiency as opposed to, robustness or resilience. In fact, somebody years ago coined this. Instead of calling it a supply chain, you should call it a supply web. And it should be operated as a web with, multiple possibility of multiple suppliers, or at least backup suppliers. I think it's just, we've been AIT'd to death. And I think that's been a big part of the problem, is this notion of, competition says, okay, we got to cut costs. Here's where we're going to cut costs. We're going to cut down, and we're going to run efficient supply chains as opposed to robust supply chains.
Great.
Yeah, I totally agree. We need greater resiliency, shorter pathways, fewer links, more emphasis also on minimization of emissions and the cost to society of the
Right.
supply chain. That's really, really important.
Right.
More emphasis on closed loop supply chains and such, and probably more insourcing, more regional food systems, also really,
Right.
really important, and more innovation along those lines. And
Super.
emphasis on quality, to me, and preservation of quality,
Right.
and enhanced
Exactly.
nutrition, really, really important.
Well, Dr. Nagurney, Dr. Lowe, thank you both very much. It's been a really interesting conversation. You've given our viewers a lot to chew on. If you would like to set up a follow-up meeting with Dr. Nagurney or Dr. Lowe or any other Informs expert, please feel free to reach out to me at jeff.cohen@informs.org. We have many other experts in addition to Tim and Anna, who can be available to you as you are contemplating policy challenges, and Informs would be delighted to be a resource. Thank you for tuning in, and look forward to seeing you again as we continue our conversations about how operations research, analytics, and data science can continue to be of aid to the policy community. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
All the best, everyone.